In your Plus S kit, you're going to find your all aluminum throttle assembly with push and pull throttle cable capabilities. Your hand controls, your left and your right hand controls, and just a quick note on these, the quality on these are insane. The feedback on all your switches is super positive, and the quality on these is going to meet or exceed your OEM quality, and they look like it too. They look like something that you would find on an original bike, which is really nice to see, because a lot of times you're trying to fabricate or refurbish older systems that are just almost too far gone. So having a nice replacement like this is cool to have. So these, I'm a big fan. Big fan of those. In your kit, you're also going to come across your output wiring harness, and this is going to be for all your dash lights and your tachometer. And then you're also going to have your input, and this is going to be for your oil pressure switch, your neutral switch, rear brake lights, as well as your ignition output signal. A baggie of installation hardware and terminal ends, and then of course the X21 Plus S module. So what this is now, this is your full feature system. It's going to have a lot more capabilities and a lot more outputs and customization than your X21 value systems. What you're going to find is on the left hand side, these three main terminals, your negative, your constant power, and then your switch power. You're going to have your inputs for your left and your right hand hand controls, your inputs for your the neutral switch, the oil pressure switch, and the rear brake light switch, as well as your ignition, your ignition power source output. Turn dials on here for adjustments for your accessory power output, your brake light brightness adjustment, and then your turn signal flash pattern adjust is on the bottom. On the right hand side of the module, these are going to be your outputs for all of your dash lights, and then these are going to be your primary outputs for things like your turn signals, your brake lights, your headlights, the starter circuit, the ignition circuit. We'll get into more of that as we go along. And then you have a couple adjustments up here as well, and we'll get into the more detail on those once we go do the installation. Speaking of which, let's go put this on a motorcycle. Mounting the X21 control module. So a couple things to keep in mind here. You want to make sure that it's somewhat protected from the elements. You know, it is pretty well protected on its own, but just keeping out of it excess water, dust, vibrations, that's just going to prolong the life of your system. And you also want it easily accessible for just attaching all your points, making it nice and neat and orderly. Plus, you want people to see that you're running an X21, because that's pretty cool. We are going to be utilizing the factory electronics plate on this CB550, and it does give us some pretty cool options as far as where we can put this. Our starter solenoid is already base installed, just to give us an idea as far as space goes. We want access to both, not just our spare fuse holder, but our primary fuse holder, as well as obviously both power terminals. So with this, I'm going to mount it right there. It gives me plenty of room for my side cover. I've already checked that out. And then now that's all that's left I got to do is drill these holes. So a cool trick to drilling those is a little piece of painter's tape, and all I'm going to do is just place that on the back side of my X21, grab myself a Sharpie, locate the holes. I can already kind of see them right inside the system, or right through the tape. That gives me the perfect template for mounting my holes wherever I want to. So now I'm just gonna kind of size it up, make sure it lines up where I want this to sit, and then I'm going to drill those holes out. So now, as you can see, we have our X21 module mounted, and one of the things that I went ahead and did, and this is a bit of a tech tip, is I started to install the fuse and as well as the terminal ends for our starter solenoid. And this is going to give me a really good idea as to where these wires are going to run, and then any other kind of modifications I need to make. There's this tab that sits on the bottom. I believe originally this held the turn signal relay. And now with that, I'm going to remove that to give myself a little bit more room for my power wires. But then I also double checked to make sure that I have enough clearance for my ground, my DC power wire and then my keyed ignition wire, or keyed switch on wire, as well as my connections for all of my inputs for my X21. These wires I will be able to route around and behind my main power lines, so I've got plenty of room and plenty of clearance. But what's important is to kind of pre-mount a few things just to make sure you are gonna have the room that you need. For the switch power for the X21, which is gonna be our center post, I'm gonna be taking that power from our keyed switch. Our keyed switch gives us two different, A and a B, so that's switch 12 volt power. It gives us two options for that. One of these wires is going to the regulator rectifier, which we installed earlier, and then this other wire I'm gonna be utilizing for the X21. Now during this installation, you're gonna see me use a lot of gray or black wire, and that's just because that's my particular situation. Space is kind of a premium in my shop and I do a lot of wiring. So I buy bulk in one of those two colors, just in various sizes or various gauges. To help me during an installation, I use something like an identification kit for wiring. Basically, it's just a bunch of different colors of small cuts of heat shrink that I can use to label my wire colors. But what's also nice is that in our kit, we have 3 of these forked terminals already with the correct color that you need for installation. So all I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pop that on there and then give it a good crimp. And then now, we can go ahead and install. And it doesn't have to be tight, just snug. Run my wire out of the way a little bit, and then we can move on to our ground and then our constant 12 volt power. For the switched power source, what I've done is I've undone one of the temporary connections that we made for our key switch. Now this one was constant power going into our keyed switch. All I did was I cut off the old heat shrink on there. We're just gonna put some new heat shrink back on. And then we're just gonna remake our connection. Now, I've said it before and I will keep saying it again. These are, you wanna make them good, strong connections, but they do not need to be permanent connections. We just wanna be able to safely ensure that our equipment works, but we wanna be able to disassemble it later on for when we go to do our final wire up. All right. Moving on, the last connection we will make is for our ground. Wanted to make a couple of notes about our engine power circuit, which is really our ignition circuit. It is going to be the second post up from the bottom. It's a pink wire. I have a white and a red identifier on it, just white and red make pink. Now that power wire, or that source wire, is going to be powering our coils. In most cases, especially on the Honda CBs, a black with a white stripe wire are going to be the 12 volt power wires in for that set of coils. Now, in our particular case, we're also running a digital ignition system in place of your traditional points and condenser system. So now that system needs a 12 volt signal in order to operate. So we're going to be splicing, I already have, but we have spliced into that wire to create another wire, another 12 volt power source that is going to be going to our ignition system, which is kind of buried down here back in the back of the motor. And then with any traditional ignition system, points or digital ignition system like we have here, one wire, one output is going to be going to the right bank of coils, and another output is going to be going to the left bank of coils. In our case, the yellow wire is going to be going to the right bank, which is cylinders 2 and 3. And a blue wire is going to be going to our left bank, which is going to be cylinders 1 and 4. That's going to really come into play later on once we start tuning our ignition system and setting the timing for our engine. But for right now, that's going to complete our ignition power for the X21. Moving on to the next bit. We're now on to section E1 of our installation guide for the X21 system. which is going to be our main lighting outputs, our headlight, our turn signals, and our tail light. Now our first two connections, the topmost post and the second post down from the top, are going to be for our right and then our left turn signals. And these are the only real outputs that we're going to have to do just a little bit extra work to. So we need to run a power wire to the front as well as to the rear of the bike. And you have kind of a couple of options to go about this. You can either plug the front and the rear wire into the same terminal right on the X21 module, or if you prefer, like as I do, to splice that wire further into your harness. So I've done a little bit of extra work, and what I've done is this is gonna be my primary output for my right-hand turn signals. It's a green wire, and I've spliced into it a little bit further down the line. Now at this point, you can either just do what I call like a soft install, just wrap the wire around, heat shrink it, just to make sure you're testing the system. But I feel confident enough that this is where I'm gonna want this splice to be. I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna solder it, and I'm gonna heat shrink it to make a permanent connection. I'm gonna do the same, this one's for the right turn signal, I'm gonna do the same for the left turn signal. And then so I'm not confusing myself when I'm starting to run these wires, as soon as I run the right-hand turn signal wire, I'm gonna hook it up directly to the turn signal. That way the ends are terminated, and I won't be confused as to where that wire goes. I'm gonna do the same thing for the left turn signal, headlight, tail light, all the way down the line. Now, I've ran the right-hand turn signal wire, I've spliced it, I've connected and terminated it at both the front and the rear turn signal. And what I wanna do now is I wanna show you exactly how I go about doing that with the left turn signal. So I've already started my wire. I've got a nice long length of wire, and I'm just going to strip the end of that, and I'm gonna plug it directly into the left-hand turn signal connection on the X21, snug that terminal down. Remember, they don't need to be super tight, just snug. And then I'm just gonna get an idea as to where this cable is gonna route on its way up to the front of the bike. So here, if you can see that all right, here's where I've made that splice for the right-hand turn signal, and about the same spot as where I wanna make the splice for my left turn signal. So I'm gonna match that length, which is about here. And all I'm gonna do is I'm just going to cut a section of the wire, and then using an X-Acto blade, be very careful doing this, so as that not to cut yourself. But I'm just gonna strip away that insulation and expose a good length of wire. I'm only stripping it about, I don't know, half an inch or so, but I just want enough that I can get, there we go, I get a good grab on it with my other length of wire. So this wire right now is going to be going to the front of the bike, and then I have this other length of wire which is going to be going to my rear. So again, I'm going to give myself a decent amount of exposed wire. And before I wrap this on, again, you don't have to make a permanent connection at this point. I'm very confident that this is exactly where I'm going to want this this portion of the wire to go. So now that I have it, I'm going to add a little piece of heat shrink in front of my splice. And I'm going to wrap my rear wire around that splice. I'm just going to kind of take a little bit of that the flux with a good solder joint. I'm going to grab my soldering iron over here. Make sure my chair doesn't roll away from me. And all I'm going to do, just make sure that is on camera, add a little bit of solder to my iron. Wait for the flux to grab the solder, start pulling it into my connection, and then just start feeding it a little bit more solder until I get decent coverage and saturation. Perfect. Lay my soldering iron down so it doesn't burn anything. Now I have a good connection. I'm going to slide my heat shrink over the connection. Grab my heat gun. And melt down that heat Set that down over there. All right, so now I'm gonna run the front portion of the wire up to my headlight bucket, and the rear portion I'm gonna run to my rear turn signal. And all I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna make a loose connection on both the front and the rear. And again, we aren't doing any kind of final wiring right now. All we wanna do is loosely wire everything together, make sure that all of our components work, and then we're gonna go back later and do our final wiring. So one of the cool features of the X21 Plus S is that it utilizes a single wire tail light. And what that means for you is that the installation is going to be a lot easier. You're not going to have to worry about running a taillight wire as well as a brake light wire. It's all done with one wire, and what it does is that it varies the voltage output to the light, and that's controlled by a dial on the bottom of the X21. So that means that you can run your traditional incandescent bulb, or in this bike's particular case, we're utilizing LEDs. Now, the turn signals also double as the bike's tail light and brake light. So this single wire system makes installation a breeze.
To wrap up section E1 on our installation guide, we need to run all of our grounding wires. What the guide kind of suggests, in a way, if you're reading it, is that each individual light or accessory gets its own separate ground. That's not really the case. What we want those accessories to be grounded. What I particularly like to do on my builds is one of two ways. Is I either like to run a single grounding wire from the front to the rear of the bike, or I'll split it up into sections. On this bike, we're going to split it into sections, a rear and then a forward. And all that means, or all we're trying to do, is reduce the total number of grounding points within our harness. The fewer grounding points you have, the less likely there is for there to be a grounding fault later on down the line. And you can kind of pick and choose and have a better, more solid grounding point too by doing it that way. So on this rear section, we're going to be grounding the license plate light, our turn signals, which are also our brake lights, directly to the same grounding point that I'm utilizing for the X21S. Now you might be thinking, what about the rear brake switch? That also requires a ground. However, within the X21S, there's a pigtail wire that has its own grounding wire in there for your rear brake light. So let's not worry about that right now. So I'm gonna wrap up the grounding for the rear end of the section. I'm gonna do the same thing for the front. The front's a little bit more involved because we have our dash indicator lights as well as our dash lights. And then of course your headlight, your turn signals up there. So we're gonna wrap this up. That'll finish out section E1. And then a quick thing to note, so section E2 is kind of optional. It really depends on what sort of bike you're building. Section E2 is going to be your front marker lights or a halo light, kind of like a daytime running light, if you're running that sort of a headlight. On this bike, we're going to be running the factory style halogen bulb up front in conjunction with our LED turn signals, which is going to be kind of cool. In which case we don't need to utilize that section. We don't need to utilize that kind of wiring. So we're gonna wrap up section E1, and then we're gonna move on to our next section after this. Moving on now to section F of our installation, guys, where we're gonna start utilizing our pigtail connectors. We have two of them. We have a red one, and that you can see by the red heat shrink close to the connector, and then a blue with the blue heat shrink close to the connector. Our blue pigtail harness is gonna be for our inputs for our rear brake light, oil pressure light, our neutral switch, and then if you're going to utilize an electronic tachometer, or if your bike has an electronic tachometer, you also have a yellow with a red tracer wire on here, which is going to go to your coils or your engine running signal. That's going to be very particular to your bike, so you're going to have to check your bike schematics, your wiring harness, to see if that is applicable to you. On this particular CB550, it has a cable-driven tachometer, so it's a mechanically driven tachometer, so we're not even going to utilize that particular wire. Once we hook this up and run our wires, it's really just going to be going down into the rear here, so we're not going to utilize all of the extra wire that we get, but you do get plenty. The red wire is going to be for our dash output lighting. It's going to be for our main backlight on the gauges, and then as well as our turn signal light, oil pressure light, neutral light, high beam light. This is going to essentially just run directly up to the front of the bike. Let's get going. Something I wanted to note while we're plugging in the wires for this pigtail is that you might end up with some excess wires that aren't going to be even utilized for your particular build. With the X21, with the Plus S system, we have the options to run a couple of accessories. fuel pumps, fan switches, auxiliary lighting, really whatever you want to run 12 volts of power to, you have the option to do so. So you'll notice on our outgoing pigtail, our red pigtail wire here, that we have some shorter wires. There are, right now there's 5 of them, shorter wires, and then you have similar colors but a much longer wire. So this would be the output wire, or your output 12 volt signal going to your additional accessories. And then these shorter wires are going to be what activate those signals. It's really up to your build. If you do have any questions, you can reach out to us online and we'll help you, of course, figure out what is, what a good use of these would be for your particular build. But just a little quick thing I wanted to note for you guys. Something to note when you're building your wiring harness is to make sure that you're giving yourself enough slack in the front end of the bike. What's really important, and some of you may have noticed that I've turned the bike around, I've supported the rear tire so that I have free motion of the front handlebar. I want to turn the handlebars all the way to the right. This is going to allow me to judge how much cable and how much slack I need when I'm at full lock on the right hand side. If you don't do this, and I can give you a close-up here on how much cable this actually pulls, you're going to pull wires out of components you do not want to be pulling wires out of. So make sure that when you're doing your wiring and judging your wire lengths, you have your steering set all the way to the right hand side, give you the most amount of room to build up your harness. We would be moving on to section G, which is our auxiliary outputs, which I kind of explained earlier with our extra wires that we have here. We are not going to be utilizing any sort of auxiliary outputs. We don't have any cooling fans or extra charging systems or anything like that, auxiliary lights, things of that sort to be powering on our bike. So these we're going to end up either cutting short, or we're just going to wrap them up and kind of hide them in our wiring loom. So with that, now we get to move on to the next section of our build, which is going to be our inputs, our plugins for our hand controls. Really simple for any of our X21 systems is that they're just 2 simple plugs, and they are color coded with the heat shrink that you see on the loom that comes out of the hand control. Bottom is, or the middle on the X21 Plus S is going to be our green, top is going to be our yellow, and we're right now just going to plug them in and finish up this section. Now that our hand controls are plugged in, we're down the last couple of steps here. Get to the exciting part. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna test the entire system to make sure that everything is working accordingly. And in order to do this, we need to install our main fuse into our solenoid, which I've already done. It's a 30 amp fuse. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna turn our ignition system on. We're gonna be looking for a couple of lights. What we want is we want to see our turn signal lights flash. And then we also want to see the X21 light. There's a blue LED inside the module itself. We want to see that flash and then come on. And what that's going to do is that's going to tell us that the system is ready. And then we can go through and we can start to check all of our different circuits, our headlights, our turn signals, our horn, flashers, hazards, everything we're going to check right now. And then once we assure that everything is working appropriately, then we can begin to clean up this mess. So what we want to see when we turn on our ignition switch is we want to see the X21 blue LED blink 3 times, then we want to see our turn signals blink twice, and then our engine oil pressure light and neutral switch should also illuminate. Don't know if you can see that, but the LEDs did blink, and then I will turn off and then on the system again. 2 flashes. That means everything's working. Low pressure light, neutral switch light. There was a blue LED that was already in there for that light, so that's why that light is blue instead of green. But now, let's go ahead and check for all of our operations. Actually, we can turn the handlebar as such. On our X21 hand control switches, we have a couple of options as far as lighting goes. Right now, you can see that the gauge lights are on. I can go completely off, kind of see in the corner here, the lights are coming back on. Now they're illuminated. I can go to lights completely on. You can see our headlight is illuminating while I'm here. We'll try our high beam switch. Oh yeah, high beams work. There's the flash. I have a flash to pass high beam switch as well as a standard high beam switch. Turn on my hazard lights. 2 LEDs in the front. 2 LEDs in the back. We're looking really good. Our license plate light is also illuminated. And we're gonna try, and as well as our indicator light up front is also illuminating. We can try left signal only. We're blinking. And we are blinking. And now go to our right turn signals. We're blinking. And we are blinking. Perfect. The indicators are working appropriately. Let's try our brake light switch. All right, so now that we have ensured that all of our lighting circuits are working appropriately, now we can move on to checking to make sure that our starting circuitry is working. Now, as you can see, I have no carburetors on my motorcycle, so you're not gonna actually hear it run, but we have, just to kind of note, I have my lighting switch all the way into the position on the right that is off. That gives us the most power for our starter. That is perfect. That's exactly what we want to see. And then now the last little accessory that we can also check is going to be our horn. I have a rag wrapped up over this, mainly because I have a sleeping toddler upstairs. So still kind of loud, but not as loud as it can be. That's 105 decibel horn. People are going to hear that. So now that we have thoroughly checked to ensure that every component on the bike is now working electronically, we can move on to cleaning up our wiring harness. Off camera, one of the things I double checked just to make sure, and it is in the installation guide, is to ensure that you have spark. That's obviously kind of a key thing to make sure of. So it's just a matter of, on cylinders, you know, I like to check 1, 2, 3, and 4, and I check all my cylinders, but it's just about pulling the spark plug out, connecting to the boot, making sure the tip of the spark plug is on a good grounding source, and then just rotate the engine. You should be seeing a periodic spark. So now that being said, let's move on to cleaning up all of this.